Monica, thank you all for joining in. And so it is a pleasure actually to be here and to talk today about the latest among my books, which is the Medieval Islamic Republic of Letters. And first of all, why did I choose that book and that field, despite the fact that I spent a lot of time on the Arabian Nights, for instance, and also because I spent a lot of time on other books, like the post-colonial, the Arabic poetry, the new trends in literature and culture, generally speaking. I thought that that was a period which was neglected for a long time. Not only that, but it was also debased in the conversations about Arabic literature and culture, generally speaking. There is a period which usually associate with the 13th century until the 19th century, and this period is always dubbed as decadent. So that period is always taken out from the culture itself and put aside. And you find that many of the modernists, generally speaking, people who wrote early on in the 20th century, were to think of that period as something just unworthy of any consideration. So I thought that is something that I should devote some attention to. And then I was invited to give 2 talks about that one day. The Cambridge History of Arabic Literature, the post-classical period, they invited me to give a talk and to contribute. And then the journal, the Mamluk Studies from Chicago, also asked me to do the same. The 2 articles which I published with them, I put them aside, waiting for another book to come together. And then I decided, no, let me go to the theoretical part, the part that is very important in order to re-establish a different tradition, and at the same time to question what has been said for a long time and taken for granted by people without really due consideration to the knowledge itself and its construction, how knowledge is being constructed. So basically what I am doing is to go to the understanding of the construction of knowledge. How is it possible to understand the formation of knowledge? Because that is what you need. You don't need a rehearsal of who is who. That is, who has been influencing whom. This becomes very minor in my consideration, because as I told you, the theoretical part is very important in order to readdress the issue, not only to Arab modernists, because Arab modernists, many of them died long time ago. That is Taha Hussein, others died some time ago, and so this is not important to us. What is important, though, is the new generation, people who began to read Arabic literature. And when they come across what George Zaidan or Taha Hussein, or a few others actually, even Ahmed Hassan Zayat, a few others, whatever they wrote, if they read what they wrote about that period, that is from the 13th to the 19th century, they are going to think in the same manner, in the same way. And they are going to neglect that period. So we have been losing 6 centuries of culture, generally speaking, simply because they were thought of as decadent, without going into the intricacies of knowledge. That is, what is knowledge itself, and what is the formation of knowledge, and so on. So first of all, I thought the first thing which I should do is to go into that and see what was written about European literatures, particularly the French. Now, let us see exactly when was the phrase Republic of Letters coined. It was coined by the end of the 17th century in France, and at that time it was a reference, as you can tell here in front of you. At that time it was thought of that this correspondence among intellectuals, poets, writers, and the reflections on each other and their own writings, that kind of networking is by itself a republic. That is to say, there is a possibility of an opinion among this group, among this network, and this possibility for passing an opinion is also a possibility to bring together ideas. And as such, a formation of a specific structure in one way or another that could be useful to the rest of Europe. And then the question certainly is, why do they think that this is a republic of letters? And why the French were desperate to have that kind of formation? Very important to see, certainly. Let us watch what the French have been doing and what the British have been doing. And let us relate these to the idea of the empire. How does the empire emerge? How does it grow? Because sometimes we miss the point. You can destroy the idea, you see, like what Trump is doing, for instance. That is, the idea of knowledge, you can destroy it very easily by being stupid and arrogant. But the idea of an empire can be built if you happen to have the right and the shrewd mind, the British mind, that is to say. The French thought that culture is the route to the empire. Commerce will help, business will help, all will help, politics, armies, yes. But first of all, you need to work through culture. And this is why they try to build a tradition of their own. This is when the French vernacular in the 16th century emerged in competition with what? Other vernaculars in Europe. And at the same time, in competition with Latin, because it needs to replace Latin, to take over and to build a national tradition. That's the only way for you. Otherwise, Latin will be dominating and will continue to dominate through the church itself. And so, that is one thing. But to build a tradition, whether it is French or British, you need also to go back. No tradition can be established simply by saying that you are doing something new. No. You need to create or to invent a tradition for yourself. Any tradition. Just go on. Because you need to deceive and to persuade people to think that you are old. You have a tradition. And this is the whole idea, as you know, of historiography. That is, you need to build a tradition. That is one way of letting people believing in you. So this is why the old then and the ancient becomes very important an element. You need to claim it in order to be new. Otherwise, your newness is meaningless. So that is the way. Yes, and here, this is why I went to Casanova, Pascal, that is Casanova, a French scholar, who wrote her book, The World Republic of Letters, in which she argues that Paris of the 16th and 17th century began to accumulate so much knowledge that it should duly claim to be the center of Europe. That is the argument. Look at the argument, how it works. I mean, we are talking about Casanova wrote just a number of years ago her book. And her argument, that is, Paris became such a republic of letters, such a center, simply because it has this kind of tradition, and this kind of tradition has been built very carefully. And she came to the argument that, okay, when the French then go back and they try to make use of whatever available of an ancient tradition, what they have been doing, they are not repeating the same thing which they borrow from old times, ancient times. What they do is that to rewrite the thing, to add to it, to claim it, and so on. So this is why she thought cultural capital itself can be reviewed and added to in one way or another, or rewritten in one way or another. And this is what she came with a phrase which is nice, I thought, a diversion of assets. Like you have assets in the bank, and you would like to diversify so that you won't suffer through the stock market, the ups and downs. This diversification will help you out, and so on. So the same thing with any tradition. You need to go and to work with a number of things, and including certainly, more importantly, the ancient tradition itself, because if you bring it together, then you are building a new cultural capital. Okay? Right now? It's okay? Okay. So if we go along with Casanova and try to see exactly whether she is right and whether what she has been claiming is good. If she claims that Paris has that concentration of literary assets and resources, and that during the 16th and 17th century, that is, Paris made such a claim and has the right to make such a claim, good. So that is very worth noticing then. Then what do we say if we find that Ibn Khaldun himself, writing in the 15th century, would claim the same thing for Cairo? He would say, no, the center of Europe, the center of the world altogether. The same period, a little bit earlier, the well-known Al-Qalqashandi, also in Egypt, would be claiming the same thing. And some of you know Al-Qalqashandi because of his 14-volume of epistolary literature, that kind of huge connection. He's a mathematician, he was a judge, and he was in the chancery, and so on. And he compiled that important Diwan al-Insha, that is, which he wrote. So, not an ordinary man, and he said the same thing about Cairo at that time. So if we compare the two, and Paris, as claimed by Casanova, was playing the role, the double role, of being centripetal and centrifugal, that is, taking and giving, attracting and sending back. And Casanova tried to associate that with what the French continued to do. That is, look at that. We are talking in cultural terms, but if you look at it carefully, then Casanova is suggesting that the imperial order, even if it goes to Senegal, as long as there are poets writing in French in Senegal or in Algeria or in Southeast Asia or whatever, then actually you are participating in building up what? A French tradition, which is quite true, by the way. So whatever we think of as a francophone is part of that cultural capital, which is French. That is an empire, you see. This is how the empire grows. Now, let us go then to more in that thing and argue what. The Latin, I mentioned to you that it was very popular, certainly, and the official language, whether in the church or among rulers or whatever. And the vernaculars throughout Europe were fighting for a place. There were no languages. So when that kind of nationalism began to emerge and to work itself out, then we find people writing in these languages, especially with the discovery of print. Because print will help a lot towards that kind of consolidation of culture. So that is all the people who are participating in this cultural capital, the schools certainly. So whether we are talking about the church or we are talking about schools and libraries, or all these are working within grammarians, teachers, whatever, people who author the books, who prepare the books, the textbook and all. These are the people who are leading the new generation and establishing a tradition, certainly. These are the people who make knowledge. This is how students get their information early on in life. I mean, yes, teachers are paid less than others simply because the societies are stupid, because these are the people who are behind the formation of knowledge. These are the people who are going to do the job for you. That is what the British noticed. Early on, if you read Macaulay, early on when they occupied India through East India Company, that's what they did. This is why he thought that a shelf of textbooks to influence the Indians is enough. And that is what they did, through culture. They made India speak English. And then the army or whatever and spices, this will come later. It is part of a thing. But the thing which was established was cultural first. That is something which we need to know. Now, if we go to the Germans are more interested also in that kind of construction, but with the understanding of what? That there is a strong connection, a tie between the spirit, as Herder will call it, of the nation, the soul of the nation, and culture itself. That is culture, you read it here in the street, you find it, and the folk tradition, and all this. This is how tradition is being made. And that is where the German soul lies. This is why they began to work on that side in the German attitude towards culture and life, and later on politics, certainly. The same tradition which brought Hitler later on. Certainly. There must be an ideological base which you are working with. It doesn't come that is Trump is coming here or Hitler is coming there. No, it doesn't work this way. It works that there are people who take that line from one generation to another, and it connects to an idea back. That is the idea in the past is the one behind the emergence of such a type. How it was inculcated, how it came into view, that is a different story then. So what Herder noticed is that the British are doing much better than any other because of their focus on literature. That was the empire. That was the empire. The empire knew that to conquer, you need to start with literature. Not with psychology, not with anthropology, no. These are other disciplines, and they are very helpful. But start with literature. So then if we go to the Islamic world and the period which we are thinking of, that is since the fall of Baghdad to the 19th century, and try to see what happened. the loss of the center. There was no center. After the loss of Baghdad, there was no center. There were very many centers. That is the new formation. The new formation which disturbed very many historians of the time, of the medieval time, was that fact. The fact that after the fall of Baghdad, they thought that the Islamic order, which used to have something pivotal, represented by Baghdad in an Islamic imaginary, despite the fact that we know that actually Baghdad was very weak, cultural speaking, that is, and as a center for the Islamic Ummah, by the 11th century. It was weakened. So, why the claim? The symbolic loss, that is what is important. The symbolic loss of the center, that was important for them. And this is why you find a jurist, an important jurist, in Egypt, for instance, at that time, he thought that the Islamic world after Baghdad has no center at all. A loss, complete loss for them. This is how. And this is how they began to think of history itself. What will happen without that center? Because the center was associated with what? With the symbolic role of the caliphate, not with the real role of the caliphate as a ruler. No. The symbolic order. However, what is happening, and we should know, whenever we think in terms of knowledge, is that actually there were very many emerging centers. Very many. That is Khawarizm, Cairo, Baghdad still, Maru, Herat, Shiraz, Isfahan, Samarkand. All of them were centers. Yes, there were fights and wars, and some of these get destroyed. If you read the introduction, which Yaqut ibn Hajj al-Hamawi, Rumi that is, wrote, he will tell you that he spent some time in such and such a place before it got destroyed, talking about the libraries which he visited and worked in. Yes, some of these centers got destroyed, and some of them, the libraries, got destroyed, but there was always a possibility of another center emerging, and that is a new phenomenon. Very important, because there is a correspondence between these. What I did, I tried to see exactly what is happening here in Maru at that time, what is happening in Cairo at that time, what is happening in Samarkand at that time, and to see exactly through a number of networks, whether we are talking about one writer here talking to another writer there, because right now we think that only us, we have the email, we have the technology, we have this, that we can really talk to each other. No, they have other means, slow, but nevertheless, they had other means. And this is why you find, if the book appeared in Cairo, for instance, or in Damascus, or in Samarkand, you find that other people in other places were writing commentaries on. When Sakaki wrote his Miftah al-Ulum, the key to sciences, which is a book supposedly on grammar, if you read how many people wrote about that, either abridged editions or expanded editions or whatever, and why? When you look at the book, and nobody obviously looked at the book carefully, which tells you how the modernists were stupid. Very, very important to notice that. Because if you look at that book, it was unique, Sakaki. It was unique in bringing the idea of grammar and the structure all together in relation to other conceptualizations. That is, how grammar is basically a logic and philosophical structure that brings into it all other formations of knowledge. This is why, for 2 centuries, and it continued actually even in the 18th century, 6 centuries later, you find people writing still about Sakaki. That is the thing. That is the thing which the modernists couldn't reach. And very many books which I consider that, look at that. Why do we have an abridgment of that? Why do we have an expanded edition of that? All these books. So what is there is a conversation among a large number of writers, scholars, and so on, all of them trying to talk to each other and to consider what is new. Along with that is the appearance of the lexicon. The lexicon, we didn't have in Arabic very many lexicons before the 10th century, Ibn Faris and whatever, and later on in Jawhari, 10th century. And later on, though, you find the accumulation of lexicons. The accumulation of lexicons. Many began to appear. Why? It was not enough to say because Arabic was in danger. No. This is a naive explanation. But the explanation is that we are talking about a constellation of knowledge. How is it possible to bring knowledge together through lexicons, through compendiums, through all this? This is the conversation. Because the lexicon is not really somebody sitting and trying to bring words and their meanings to you. No. Just go into one of these important dictionaries like Ibn Mandur, Lisan al-Arab, for instance, or Fairuz Abadi, or any other dictionary. You will see that actually you are reading more than that. It is not a word and the meaning of that word. It is, if there are new words emerging, if whatever is being said different from whatever is being said 2 centuries ago, and so on. So we are talking about another structure of knowledge, another something which is very important, and at the same time, drawing our attention to something new in knowledge, that is the street itself, by its craftsmen, professionals, giving us a new dimension to the language. And this is why their language is included in the dictionary and the lexicon. So we are talking then about a different audience. You see, a different audience. Look at that. But the moment we try to give this a form, to give it a shape, we need to see it within the whole understanding of how languages grow. Languages, generally speaking, grow this way. First of all, if you look back in history, you find that usually there is always a sign and the signified, and an act of resemblance. So this is why you find them brought together and given to you. Then you find whenever knowledge gets more sophisticated, that is, there will be a binary structure. A binary structure. So this, and so on. But this then will break up more, because people get more distance from what they know of the language and the root of the language and the early meaning of that language. The association between the sign and the signified will be weaker, much weaker. And as such, you find what is happening, what is taking place is the semblance, something different. And especially when you go to philosophical discourse, generally speaking, you find that we are talking about new words which are created in order to meet the new demand for conceptualization. So philosophy will bring that dissemblance in language, generally speaking. Not only this, but the significance of this move is very important to look at when you consider Arabic. For instance, that is, in Arabic, we know that there was a fight for a long time between people who read the Quran, for instance, literally as it appears, and people who read it as majaz, as metaphorical. Now, two different traditions. So, two different traditions. But this movement is going to grow. The Wahhabis, certainly in Saudi Arabia, for instance, will try to go to the literal meaning. And they use it. And they use it whenever it is convenient, certainly. And they reject as much as possible any idea of majaz. That is, according to them, there is no such thing. There is no. God said his word, and that is the word of God, and that's the end. And the word of God means to them something else. And that is a huge difference, certainly. Now, but this brings us to the significance and the growth of rhetoric itself. Why the attention which was paid to rhetoric and began to grow in Islamic tradition, generally speaking. You find that people who participated, like Ibn Wahb al-Katib, like Sakkaki, like Al-Qazwini, like Taftazani, all of them from different parts of the Islamic world. Remember that rhetoric becomes very central to the understanding of Islam itself. And these people were strong participants in that. Had rhetoric been an ordinary issue, Islam itself will be an ordinary issue. Because look at that. I mean, Christianity passed through stages in which rhetoric became very important for them for the study. And this is how central it was for the study of the Bible, for instance. Now, along with that, though, there appeared a different kind of poetry, a number, certainly, of poetry. One of them is the Panegyric to the Prophet, long poems dedicated this time to the Prophet. Not 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, very many. Starting with Al-Busiri and go on. Until the 20th century, you find very long poems written in that tradition. Now, along with that tradition, though, there was a new phenomenon, which was there was always an explanation of the rhetorical figures in that poem. And the writer, the poet himself, is the one who provides you with that kind of register. So you find his poem and her poem, and at the same time, his rhetorical figures explained to you. Now, this is new altogether, and we need to understand why and how significant that was. First of all, there was a change in the readership. Otherwise, why do we talk about such a massive accumulation of compendiums, lexicons, compilations, authored material, and so on? How can we understand it? Does this mean, again, the patron? That is to say, somebody reciting a poem in front of the caliph or the ruler and getting paid for that, and that's the end of it? That is the transaction? No. These people, they don't have patrons. They are on their own. Meaning what? That there was a readership then, a large readership, and the writer was able to survive on that kind of readership. So a new patronage was emerging, the readership itself, between the author then and the patron. This will lead us to the understanding of, okay, if there is such a readership, does this mean that actually writing itself had passed and undergone a number of changes? Yes. First of all, there is more of the conversational style. So you find in writing, in poetry, in everything, a conversation. The style is not of somebody standing up there and telling others to listen. No. There is always a kind of conversation in order to establish a relationship between the author, whether it was a poet or a scholar, and the lexicographer, and the reader. So you need to bring all these conversations together, and that is exactly what is happening. The street language invaded the dictionary, and you find it in there. This kind of invasion of the dictionary was important by itself at that time, and this is why you find that very many people who worked on their dictionaries cared for that. This means that these people who coined new words, and they were craftsmen and professionals, some of them blacksmiths, some of them carpenters, whatever, they brought new blood in the language, which was in conversation with the rest of the society. And these people created a new, as I told you, readership, because they connect the author to the marketplace. That is great development. We are no longer speaking about somebody addressing the court, the ruler, or a few others, or people in a majlis, specific majlis. No. We are talking about a larger movement within the societies. That is something. So, at that time, and also the modernists thought that this development shows more that we are talking about decadence. What is that? That is when they saw the appearance of what it is called a tawriya. And they couldn't understand why tawriya was very popular at that time. Tawriya, that is the double entendre, became very popular because it was pushing the metaphor and the conceit far. That is to say, more separation. So that is the meaning between the sign and the signified is no longer there, but there is something far away for the meaning. You, as a reader, you are given a few chances to see exactly which one the poet or the writer means, and so your mind will be working. The tawriya gets you involved in the meaning itself and implicates you as a reader. That is quite important by itself. As I told you, the modernists missed that again. And they couldn't understand why somebody who was so prominent, like Al-Qadi Al-Fadil, the minister of Salah ad-Din Al-Ayyubi, for instance, spent a lot of his time on writing about tawriya, and also, his correspondence and writing always using tawriya. And they couldn't understand why Ibn Nabat al-Musri, the poet, was very much involved in that, and Ibn Hijjah was involved in that, and so on. So you find that then we are talking about a movement altogether, which is very important for us to notice. This movement is from the center of the literati to the fringes of the society, to the margins. And that can explain to you why the appearance of the conversational style. It was not a weakness. It was a new development in readership. The common reader is there right now. And you are no longer addressing only a few people. No. It is a large kind of readership across all these lands. You are no longer talking about Egypt, Iraq, Syria, and whatever. You are talking about all these lands altogether. Okay? And so then the canonical works, the works that were taken for granted as canons for a long time in the classical tradition, were replaced by a new kind of books. That is something, right? Which means what? First of all, the author is free to develop his own or her own style. They are no longer bound to an earlier understanding of what you need to know in order to be a writer. If you read Abd al-Hamid al-Katib, the Katib, that is, the scribe of the Umayyad, you find him emphasizing in his letter to his companions, the other scribes, emphasizing a few points to them. This is what you should learn in order to be a good scribe. Now we have something else. We have something else which you need to understand, and that is how you connect to the people and how you can claim yourself to be somebody who brought something in you. And that is what the writers and poets of the period under consideration have been doing. The conversation which I am talking about was not limited to the author or the poet and the reader. It was there among poets themselves. This is why you find they reflect on each other, and this poem will reflect on another poem. Not in the old style of mu'arada, which is there. All of you who studied Arabic know the mu'arada between Jarir and Farazdaq and whatever. No, there is more in that kind of tradition. So people reflect, writers, poets, on each other, and epistolographers, all of them, and the critics, and so on. Certainly, does this mean when we speak about that broad knowledge, that Islamic ummah, do we speak then of the Quran and the studies of the Quran as minimal? That is to say, they are no longer central? No, they were there. Always, as they are there. But there is a shift, though. The shift, when I said the panegyrics were addressed to the Prophet, for instance, well, this is part of a larger shift in which in knowledge construction you find, as I said, poets, writers, authors were addressing a human. Even in the Badi'iyya tradition, the poem addressed to the Prophet, they are addressed the human. You see? So they are not addressing God in this case. Neither did they address the caliph or the ruler. It is a different tradition. Tradition, the knowledge is humanized gradually. It became something which relates to the humans. Meaning what? Meaning that we are talking about concrete situations. We are no longer dealing with abstractions. That is one side. Also, does this mean that there was a shift to prose or a shift to poetry? Neither. It didn't work this way. There was poetry and there was prose, but we are talking about a wide readership and at the same time of new structures taking place within these societies and sultanate or whatever. Each ruler would try to build his own court, like what you find in Timur, for instance, Timur-Lenk. But at the same time, you find that he was trying his best to get every important author to his court in Samarkand, because he would like to beat Baghdad of all times. And so he had discussions and conversations among the prominent figures at that time in front of him. That is, and who is the winner in that kind of discussion? Certainly you can say, well, that was exactly what was happening in the 9th and 10th century Baghdad. That is quite true. And that would continue everywhere. But what I am saying is that the expansion of knowledge is no longer limited to an Arab, that is a person, a ruler or whatever. It was there all over, and even when other vernaculars were used, Persian or whatever, still the knowledge and the medium and the discussion in rhetoric was Arabic. Because that is the sign of knowledge. And then the emergence of prosimetrum. That is, here there is spelling mistake. There should be prosimetrum. M-E-M in front of the T. So if the movement to bring that together, that is the prosimetrum, that is poetry and the prose in the same structure. It was one way of accommodating all these divides. That is how to bring all together in communication, which was very important because it will, as I mentioned, revitalize the language itself. You are bringing new blood in the language by bringing poetry and prose together and other attitudes. But this is not enough. You can say, but does this mean that the elitist prose died? No, it doesn't mean that. But there is something else taking place alongside the fact that we are talking about a classical tradition. So classical tradition was no longer the only medium available for people. There were other traditions which are very important. And this is why you find the concretization, how language got concrete. That is to say, instead of the abstraction, and the abstraction was everywhere, even when you describe anything, there was abstraction. But right now, in these 6 centuries, there was a tendency towards the concrete itself, how it is possible to bring. This is why you find titles of books. Look at the titles of books here. And you can tell that language gets more concrete right now in these titles. And so on. So that is something worth looking at, right? And yeah, so I mean, otherwise, why should they care for this creation of new titles unless there is something important then to see? Now, I mentioned the Tawriya to you and how important it is. I mentioned Sakaki, I mentioned Al-Qazwini, I mentioned the kind of register which is emerging, that is to say people are no longer speaking about somebody who was brought up in a tradition which was rich and whatever. No, they began to claim that they were a Sami, that is to say a self-made and independent person. That is you made through your effort. It started with very many, including Yaqut himself, who would say in the introduction that he was a slave to a merchant. And here he is. And so on. So you find people who began to claim their origin as not necessarily people who belong to a wealthy kind of family who got them very good education and tutorship. No. Okay. So that is something to see. And this is why you find very many among these scholars and poets were businessmen, they were craftsmen, as I mentioned, and this is why their significance to the tradition which we are talking about. Zamakhshari, Al-Watwat, and all these people. Then the question which can come to your mind is this new only to this period? Well, you can go back to the 10th century and you can say, well, what about Abu al-Faraj al-Isfahani and his massive compendium of Aghani, the songs, the book of songs? What do we think of Ikhwan al-Safa when they collected all these epistles on mathematics, geography, philosophy, everything? Well, these were prototypes for these new constellations. But we are talking about a movement right now, not one single phenomenon. We are talking about something which was massive, a massive movement taking place everywhere. Then something noticeable, plagiarism. That is, people, writers, through these centuries began to criticize each other and to claim that somebody was a plagiarist. And some of them were close friends, and they began to talk like that. And you will be surprised. Why? Well, first of all, does this mean that there was actual plagiarism? Well, the moment we are talking about this kind of trafficking, the moment we are talking then about the availability of material, then it is possible that they reflect on each other, and at the same time they might make massive quotes from each other. And because it is what? It was open market. That is, all the space was open to you, and you do your readings and your compilations. If you are an original writer like Sakaki, you will create your own book. But if not, then you are going to compile and to add and so on. So you find that we are talking about an economy, a new market, an open market culture, which was available in that Republic of Letters, which made the transmission by itself available, but at the same time in trouble. That is to say, how can you transmit? Or are you going to transmit like what they used to do? That is to tell you, I am telling you this story because somebody told me such and such and such. You have it both ways. There is this, but at the same time, you have people who compile and they don't need to claim anything, and so on. This is why the problem, when the modernists came and tried to look back, they found that very many of these books were shuruh, explanations, marginalia, people writing about each other, this book, that book, and so on. And this is why they thought that this is not important by itself. But it is important by itself. And usually, because you are not going to make a comment on any other book unless you feel you are attached to that and you have something to reflect on. Otherwise, why should you bother? That is the whole idea. So it is very important, certainly, to see that this marginalia and these commentaries were central to the understanding of the Republic of Letters itself. And so is the compendium itself, because it means that I am making available for a large readership this compendium which contains knowledge from everywhere, on every field. Obviously, there was a readership for that. Had the readership been not interested in this kind of writing and this availability, the writer and the compiler would not bother to undertake such a project, which is tiring and time-consuming at the same time. So why should they do it? Unless there was a demand, unless there was a reader who needs that. That is something which we need to understand. So then we are talking about actually a growth over a number of centuries of genealogical structures in every field of knowledge, which made it available for all this readership in order to meet the horizon of their expectations. Definitely that means that there is a different cultural script emerging in this very period in order to accommodate the wishes and the desires and the ambitions of their readers. This is when we look back and try to see this networking of scholars, libraries, and also the inclusion of the social at large. And we notice that there were people who wrote later on in the century, in the 17th, 18th centuries, and criticizing all these books and compendiums and lexicons. We can understand, usually we are talking about a real rich cultural movement, and this is why, for instance, Sherbini, when he wrote his Al-Quhuf, as he called it, when he wrote that book, he made fun of that tradition. He made fun not because he was outside that tradition, but because he was inside it and would love to be outside it at the same time. So playing that kind of ambivalent role inside and outside within that kind of tradition. The chancery, because the chancery itself, which was dynamic for the state structure, certainly, the one in Shah, like you say, State Department, like the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, or the Ministry of Information, that was the chancery in the medieval period. So it was very prominent center, very important. People who could reach it, not only they could get good salaries, but at the same time, it means there was a social and political recognition. And this is why Al-Qalqashandi, when he wrote about the chancery at that time, he described it as a canon of politics. Qanun al-siyasa, he called it. Very important to know. So this kind of structure then was very important to lead us into our understanding of what is the meaning of a republic of letters. A republic of letters then is that kind of massive network which has been growing over centuries all over the Islamic land, and in which there were so many participants, whether we are talking about readers, poets, scholars, grammarians, teachers, all of them were participating certainly in that. Poetry itself, though, popular poetry in particular, was also prominent in that republic of letters. Very important kind of poetry. So craftsmen were writing poetry, professionals were writing poetry, and so on. Not only that, even the folklore tradition and the storytelling tradition happened to grow within that period itself. Yes, I mean, the Arabian Nights, the 1001 Nights, that is Alif Layla, wa Layla, began to appear early on. That is, it was available, I mean, not in full, but tales of Alif Layla were available by the 9th century, for instance. But the accumulation is very important for us to notice that there were very many tales added to it over centuries until we get a kind of full manuscript by the 14th century. Meaning what exactly? There was an oral tradition, but also a written tradition, a popular tradition for that matter, which is working at the same time like other constellations, like other lexicons, like other compendiums. All of them were working within that very particular period, which made it very dynamic period and the construction of knowledge itself, and which could not bypass and put aside simply because we don't have the time to read it and to go through it, or because there was no training in that kind of direction. The modernists, as I mentioned, could be blamed for that kind of negligence, because what they did, they skipped that substantial portion of Arabic literature, which was written and constructed in Arabic, and which could have been a very rich field for research and understanding, especially when you go into the different sides of that kind of tradition, the satirical, the comic, and the serial, and the serious. All of them were very important when you look at them together. That was the conversation we are talking about in these very constellations, and also in the assemblies which happened to take place over a number of centuries. I think that is the time. Thank you so much.